Hi everyone, I'm Jenn Hobbs and I'm going to be talking you through in this video a brief overview of my article Capacitating Militarised Masculinity, Genitourinary Injuries, Sex and Sexuality and US Military Medicine. So in this article, I am arguing that US militarised masculinity operates through the selective distribution of bodily capacities. Militarised masculinity is achieved through the creation of bodily capacities through some bodies and the denial of those capacities to others. And I'm arguing that the US military invests in producing heterosexual and cisgender bodily capacities for some, and that this happens through the concurrent debilitation of queer, trans, and racialized populations. So the article begins from the feminist premise that the bodies of soldiers are important to the workings of international politics. They're really important for warfighting, but also for the broader mobilization and legitimization of violence around the world. Feminists have explored the bodies of soldiers as gendered and masculinized subjects, showing how masculinity has historically been crucial to constructing this figure of the soldier. And feminists have kind of, shown to us that by looking at militarized masculinity, we can learn a lot about how the politics of gender, sex, race, militarism, and sexuality are produced and circulated in international politics. We're probably all reasonably familiar with this story of the soldier as being, this kind of idealized, quite privileged form of masculinity in society. But feminist scholars have also shown us that there's a bit of a danger in just repeating this story. And that danger is that we end up making these identities look a lot more stable and a lot more cohesive than they might actually be. And that's where this article kind of steps into the frame. So it's aiming to contribute to attempts to destabilize militarized masculinity by looking at how military masculinities are produced within the area of military medicine, and specifically the treatment of genitourinary injuries. So to build up this argument, I focus on the treatments that are offered to male US service members who have suffered genitourinary injuries. Genitourinary injuries are injuries to either the genitalia or the urinary tract, and they've been on the rise in recent years in soldiering populations following the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. While service members have always been vulnerable to these types of injury in combat, they're on the rise for two reasons. So firstly, advances in military medicine mean that these injuries are more likely to be survivable than in previous decades. And secondly, the prevalence of improvised explosive devices in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. These account for about 75% of genitourinary injuries in male service members. These injuries are often experienced by service members as very traumatic. And one of the reasons that they are so traumatic, one of the things that produces and contributes to this trauma is because these injuries can really disrupt and challenge a person's sense of identity. And this challenge to identity comes from the ways in which these injuries can trouble ideas about gender. Right? They disrupt the dominant cultural narrative that we have about gender and sex, which very much links both of these concepts to genitalia. So GUIs have the potential to trouble service members' abilities to feel and be recognized by others as men, as male. This article does focus specifically on men and not women here, because men make up the vast majority of service members who are living with genitourinary injuries, or GUIs, and I do briefly outline some of the reasons behind that in this article. But in the paper, I focus on two types of treatments for genitourinary injuries. So firstly, surgical treatments, primarily in the area of penile transplants, which are quite a novel and quite a new form of transplant medicine. Secondly, I also look at fertility treatments for these injuries. And in looking at those treatments, I apply this kind of analytical lens of capacity and debility, two concepts that are developed by Jasbir Puar, and whose interpretation I'm quite indebted to in her book, The Right to Maim. So I show that these treatments manage GUIs through governing the bodily capacities of service members, right? They change what these bodies can do. And I show how these injuries are managed then through the attempt to produce masculine bodily capacities, things like urinating while standing, the ability to have erections and penetrative sex, and to father children, to biologically reproduce. And what the article explores is how these treatments, in attempting to heal these bodies through restoration of masculine capacity and masculine function, how these treatments play into existing dynamics within society that work to render certain bodies invisible. And in the paper, I look at how these treatment options operate around the debilitation of queer and trans bodies and lives, as well as the bodies of Iraqi and Afghan civilians. So the article is arguing that this debilitation happens through creating a hierarchy of whose body is seen as deserving of masculine capacity and of medical intervention. So if you're interested in reading more, you can find my paper in the Review of International Studies. And if you have made it to the end of this video, thank you very much for your time.